Thank you. Oh my gosh, it's absolutely wonderful to be here. It's great to be back here with Terry, with KUSP, with all of you to celebrate 40 years in your ears, KUSP. Wow. But that really is a landmark, and we are traveling the country celebrating independent media. We started in Sarasota, Florida, right after the Tampa convention, celebrating WSLR, low-power community radio station. And when we went on to WMNF, a big community radio station in Tampa. We remember in each of these cases, in places like Richmond, Virginia, WRIR, they would come to previous events for years saying they really wanted to have a community radio station. And then they get the support in their community, and they find the window where a low-power or full-power FM station is being offered. And they apply for it, and then we come out for a fundraiser to help them raise the money to get pay for the transmitter, and they have a certain amount of time before they can go on the air. And it's just been amazing to see as community media is built all over this country. I see the media as a huge kitchen table that stretches across the globe, that we all sit around and debate and discuss the most important issues of the day: war and peace, life and death. And anything less than that is a disservice to the servicemen and women of this country. They can't have these debates on military bases. They rely on us and civilian society to have the discussions that lead to the decisions whether they live or die, whether they are sent to kill or be killed. Anything less than that is a disservice to a democratic society. So to be here with all of you, I wanted to start, well, with a joke. My brother Steve, who's up at Stanford, sent this to me. His rabbi shared it on the High Holy Days, and, well, it's a true story. Commander Horatio Hornblower was on the deck of his ship and saw a light ahead. This is the exchange that followed. Boat number 1 to approaching light. We're on a collision course. Turn your boat 10 degrees north. Light flashes back. Yes, you are on a collision course. Please turn your boat 10 degrees south. Boat 1 signals again. I'm an admiral. I'm commanding you to turn your boat 10 degrees north. Light flashes back immediately. I'm a seaman second class, and I'm telling you to turn your boat 10 degrees south. The admiral is furious. He flashes back. I repeat, I'm a Navy admiral, and you are hereby ordered to turn your boat 10 degrees north. I am in a battleship. Light returns a signal, and I am commanding you to turn your boat 10 degrees south. I am in a lighthouse. So much for hierarchy. Well, as you know, I come from Pacifica Radio, which was founded more than 60 years ago in Berkeley, California, by a man named Lou Hill, war resistor, came out of the detention camps and said there's got to be a media outlet not run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists. And that's how Pacifica was born. Not run by corporations, as George Gerbner, the former dean of the Annenberg School of Communications at the University of Pennsylvania, used to say. Not run by corporations that have nothing to tell and everything to sell, that are raising our children today. And so the first Pacifica station went on the air in 1949, KPFA, 1959. KPFK, we were just celebrating on Friday night. KPFA will celebrate in Oakland tomorrow night. My station, WBAI, went on the air in 1960, 1977, WPFW in Washington, 1970, KPFT, the Houston station. It's the only radio station in the country whose transmitter was blown up. It was 1970. It was in the spring. They had just gone on the air, and the Klan strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blew it to smithereens. I don't know. They got back on their feet. it's not as if Pacific had money to advertise their new station, so it certainly blew it into the consciousness of the potential listening audience of the people of the Petro Metro. But when they got back on their feet and rebuilt their transmitter, the Klan blew it up again, right in the middle of Arlo Guthrie singing Alice's Restaurant. Now, I don't know if it was the Grand Dragon, the Exalted Cyclops, or the Imperial Wizard, because I often confuse their titles, but he said it was his proudest act. I think it's because he understood how dangerous independent media is. Dangerous because it allows people to speak for themselves, and there is nothing more powerful. When you hear a Palestinian child or an Israeli grandmother, when you hear an Iraqi aunt or an Afghan uncle, it breaks down barriers that fuel the hate group. It challenges the stereotypes that fuel the hate groups that so endanger us. On this 100-city tour, we started in Sarasota. We were, 20 minutes late. And I said, my God, if we're 20 minutes late for the first radio station, we're going to be months late on the last one. Today we didn't do too bad, just about an hour late. But the journey has been amazing. We were in Blacksburg, Virginia, at Virginia Tech, right before the University of Denver first presidential debate, which the Brady campaign against gun violence had attempted to get a question on gun violence asked. You know, University of Denver near Aurora, near Columbine, sort of made sense. And they waged this campaign, got tens of thousands of signatures to get Jim Lehrer, the first moderator of the first presidential debate, to ask a question on gun violence. So we went down to Virginia Tech because, well, Colin Goddard was a student there. You know, in 2007, 32 people were killed at Virginia Tech in another massacre. And he was shot 4 times. He now works for the Brady campaign against gun violence, but he came down with us to Virginia Tech, and I walked with him through Norris Hall, where the massacre took place, part of it, the worst part of it. We were walking through this, cinder block typical college building with tile floors, except when you turn the corner to this one corridor, because they've changed it now and it has wood paneling. He was in room 211. They've taken away that number. And it was 9 o'clock French class, and he was deciding with a friend whether they'd rather just go for breakfast, and they sort of were weighing this in the car, and then he decided, oh shucks, I should go to class. And so he shows up late, and the French professor rolls her eyes as usual. Colin sits down in the corner, the class starts, and about halfway into it, Rachel, the best student in the class, comes in rather frazzled, and she says, I'm so sorry I was late. He'd never come to class before her. And she says to class, there was a shooting in my dorm this morning, and the authorities kept us. And everyone looked at each other very surprised. No one knew about any kind of shooting. And then they heard this crack, crack, crack. They thought it was maybe construction outside. And then they heard it again coming closer, and they were afraid that this was gunshot. And the French professor poked her head out of the door and turned around and said to all the students, get under your desks now. She was the first killed. Colin dove under his desk. He said he'd never called 911 on his Nextel phone, so he calls up 911, and he says, quick, Norris Hall, there's been a shooting. And they said, where's Norris Hall? And he said, Norris Hall, Virginia Tech. Where's Virginia Tech? He said, Virginia Tech, Blacksburg. Blacksburg where? Blacksburg, Virginia. Virginia? Anyway, eventually, but he is under the desk, he is whispering. They connect him to authorities. Somehow he loses his phone, and he only learns later the young woman in the desk underneath next to him had grabbed it and was speaking to the authorities all throughout the killings. The student walked in the class. All Colin could see was his army fatigues, and then he felt the gunshot in his hips and his shoulders. And he talked about what it meant in this class of 16 for 9 of his classmates and his French professor to have been killed on that morning. right before I talked to Colin, I went to see Nikki Giovanni, the great poet, who is a university distinguished professor at Virginia Tech. I knew she doesn't like to talk about the massacre, but, well, I was in her office, and it was this wonderful place. She was very excited because she was hosting, and I think it's happening just about now, this special celebration of her friend Toni Morrison, who is coming to Virginia Tech. Toni Morrison just lost her son Slade, who she dedicated her book Sula to. And Nikki Giovanni just wanted to do something for her. So she said, so I called the doc and we organized this. I said, who's the doc? And she said, well, that's Dr. Maya Angelou. And so there at Virginia Tech, go to the website, because if it hasn't already happened, it's going to be saved there. It's this big free event. That's what Nikki Giovanni insisted on, celebrating Maya Angelou and Toni Morrison. And so she was all full of beans talking about this, and we sat down, and I was asking about her art, her poetry, and then I asked her about the shooting, see if maybe she would talk about it. And she said she was in San Francisco for a meeting. She didn't know what possessed her, but she said she had to go home. She hadn't heard about anything happening, and nothing had happened yet. And they said, but you've just flown here from Virginia. She said, I'm turning around. And she got on a plane and went home. And she was driving from the airport down the highway toward Blacksburg, and a local TV station shot by around in a car around 120 miles an hour, and she turns on a radio, and she is hearing that there's been this shooting, and the police have blocked off the Blacksburg exit, and she hears shooting, massacre, and she says, oh, it must be Cho. Cho was her poetry student, and he was the shooter. She had taught him a few years before, and she said she could not reach him. He would wear sunglasses, his hat over his face, pulled down low, and she found him mean and menacing, and she was very afraid, and she told him she wanted him out of her class. And he said, no, you can't make me. And she said, that's true. Then I'll resign my professorship and leave, she said. And she told that to the heads of her department. She said, if he's not gone by the next class, I will resign. So she knew there was something terribly wrong. She said, I teach difficult students all the time. She said, I've taught kids with autism. I've taught kids who have Tourette's. But there was something terribly wrong, she said. How is it that all of the red flags, he stalked young women on campus for more than a year, he'd been institutionalized. How is it that he could legally get a gun? This is what Colin Goddard wanted to know. And he was very understanding in talking about this young man who shot bullets into him that Colin has to this day in his body. But he said, how is it? Which is why he wanted the presidential candidates to be asked this question, to be challenged around how it is that these candidates are so in the pocket, whether you're talking about the Democrats or the Republicans of the National Rifle Association, how there could be a force more powerful than common sense around the issue of guns. That was our trip to Blacksburg, and we broadcast Colin and Nikki Giovanni speaking the next day, and then we flew out from Washington to Colorado. And we expanded the debate, that first debate at the University of Denver. How many of you have heard this Expanding the Debate series, which we're doing again Monday night in Marin? So, you know, it's pretty straightforward. How many of you understand who runs these debates, why it is the debates are the way they are? It used to be run, remember, by the League of Women Voters, a completely independent body, and they ran it for decades. And then the parties had enough. They didn't like the idea of third-party candidates introduced, and they wanted more control. And so they handed the League of Women Voters in the 1980s a secret 12-page contract and said, you'll sign this. And they not only said no, they held a news conference and they released the secret contract to the press. And that was it for the parties. And they formed the Commission on Presidential Debates, which sounds like some kind of government or independent body. It's a private corporation. And it's headed by, well, it was started by the heads of the Republican and Democratic Party. The head of the Republican Party at the time remains the head of it, Frank Fahrenkopf, and the Democratic leader is Mike McCurry now, who was Clinton's press person. Remember, Mike McCurry, now top lobbyist for the telecoms. This is a very good bet for the parties, right, which is something Frank Fahrenkopf appreciates, since he is the executive director of the American Gaming Association, chief lobbyist for gamblers in this country. And they make the rules. The parties and the candidates sign off on the rules, and we don't know what they are. We don't know what they've agreed to. We know that they are sponsored by private corporations like Anheuser-Busch and the International Bottled Water Association. So the night that they were debating at University of Denver, we were looking online that date because we want to copy exactly what they look like. Big blue backdrop, we have that says Democracy Now! On it. And then we looked at the podiums that they would use, and we got podiums. We rented them from some little rental shop, and we dressed them up. And we broadcast from a Comcast facility down the road from this gated debate. We just weren't sure, what should we put on the podium? We were going to have Jill Stein, the presidential candidate of the Green Party, and Rocky Anderson, former mayor of Salt Lake City, who is the presidential candidate for the Justice Party. We had asked Gary Johnson, former New Mexico governor, who's the Libertarian candidate, but he has declined so far. So we had these two podiums. We wanted them to look exactly the same. So should we put Bud Light on the podium? Is that what President Obama and Mitt Romney would have on their podiums, or bottled water? We weren't sure. But anyway, so we were there when the debate began, and we broadcast this all over the country. It started with Jim Lehrer welcoming everyone to the University of Denver and then saying, we'll start with the economy. President Obama, you won the coin toss. You have 2 minutes. And then Mitt Romney, 2 minutes. And then we stopped the video, and we said, Dr. Jill Stein, the economy, 2 minutes. And Rocky Anderson, you have 2 minutes on the economy. And after Rocky Anderson spoke, I said, now back to my colleague Jim Lehrer at the University of Denver. And we did that throughout, and we're going to do that tomorrow in Marin, Monday, for the last presidential debate. It'll be Bob Schieffer. And you know who ultimately did ask the question about gun violence? Of course, it wasn't one of the TV moderators. It was at the town hall at Hofstra, and we were out at Hofstra. We ran a parallel town hall. It was one of the people in the audience who asked a question about gun violence and about the power of the National Rifle Association. So we broadcast that debate, and we're continuing that. And then we went to Colorado Springs on the eve of the 11th anniversary of the war in Afghanistan, the longest war in U.S. history. We decided to broadcast from this heavy military Colorado Springs has many military installations, Fort Carson and Air Force Academy, and what better place to do this broadcast? We did it from the Tim Gill Center for Public Media, which had just opened, part of Rocky Mountain PBS, and we had on Dave Phillips. He won the Pulitzer, or was nominated for a Pulitzer, for his series on this unit at Fort Carson called Lethal Warriors. They called themselves that. They went to Iraq, came back, went to Iraq, came back, and they just couldn't turn off the kill switch. They were killing their girlfriends at Fort Carson, their wives, other soldiers, strangers. The murder rate at Fort Carson, 114 times that of surrounding Colorado Springs. You could only imagine what they were doing in Iraq. And we talked with a man named Andrew Pagani, who counsels soldiers and veterans. He himself had been in Iraq. He'd been there just a few days. He'd taken Lariam, and he said he was hallucinating. That's the anti-malaria drug. And he saw a Bradley tank just explode in Iraqi. And he fell apart. He had a complete breakdown. And he went to his higher-ups, said he needed help. And he's the first soldier since Vietnam to be charged with cowardice. Do you know what a soldier faces who is charged with cowardice? The death penalty. Just another story on the road. And then we went back to Denver. I was invited by Al Jazeera English to debate the former president of ABC World News Tonight, David Weston. He just stepped down last year or the year before. So I was brought into the PBS News studio, the NewsHour, with Jim Lehrer, interestingly, when they work out of Denver. And David Weston was in a studio in New York, and Shahab, the moderator, was in Washington. And we were talking about the war and elections, and David Weston was saying that the media, asks the right questions, probes, investigates, that the criticism isn't fair. And he said that they do a very good job doing this, expanding the debate, because I had described what we did, with the debate and bringing in third-party candidates. And when he said they did a very good job, I said I beg to differ. And I used the example going back to 2003, 6 weeks before the invasion of Iraq. This critical moment, the moment, when the country is half for the war, half against the war, when Noam Chomsky says the media is manufacturing consent for war. It was February 5th, 2003, the day Secretary of State Colin Powell gave his speech at the UN, the final nail in the coffin for so many. Because for many, General Colin Powell was a very credible figure. He'd been dragging his feet on the war, didn't necessarily believe that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, but when he said the evidence is in, that it is an imminent threat, that did it. And he later said it was a stain on his career. But the group FAIR, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, FAIR.org, did a study of the 4 major nightly newscasts in that 2 weeks around Colin Powell giving his push for war at the UN. The NBC Nightly News, CBS Evening News, PBS NewsHour with Jim Lehrer, and David Weston's outfit, the ABC World News Tonight. And they looked at these 2 weeks. There were 393 interviews done around war. Guess how many were with anti-war leaders? 3. 3 of almost 400. That is no longer mainstream media. That is an extreme media beating the drums for war, I said to David Weston. And he said, it may surprise you, Amy, to know that I agree with you. I was very surprised. And he said he will forever regret that when Peter Jennings was alive, Peter Jennings worked for Weston, he didn't believe the weapons of mass destruction argument. Peter Jennings died of lung cancer. And David Weston said, I pushed back, and I told him to hold back on that. And he said, I will forever regret this. He said, I was under a lot of pressure. So, from there, we moved on through Colorado to Los Alamos, to the birthplace of the nuclear age. And we broadcast from Fuller Lodge, which was built in 1928 as an elite boys' school. And a very disgruntled Gore Vidal went there as a kid and hated it. We broadcast from this lodge that in 1943 was taken over by the U.S. government to begin the Manhattan Project, headed by J. Robert Oppenheimer, the top secret project that developed the nuclear bombs that were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. J. Robert Oppenheimer would later say, I am the shatterer of worlds, quoting the Bhagavad Gita, when they saw the kind of destruction that the bombs they developed had wrought. And we had this remarkable show. We had on a whistleblower from Los Alamos. We had on a longtime anti-nuclear activist very concerned about the billions that is being poured right now into nuclear weapons, and a young Navajo woman of the Diné Nation, deeply concerned about the poisoning of the Navajo lands with uranium mines and uranium tailings when the mines are closed. But then we also talk about solutions, because when we drove from Durango to Taos, as usual, well, this time we were actually a little bit early, like 15 minutes early. And so as we're driving along the road, and the other people I'm driving with are saying, do not look to the left. Yes, to the left, because there's these amazing houses that are built into the earth. And of course, we had to stop there. I mean, we were 15 minutes early, so we had plenty of time. So we drove in, and it was incredible. These houses were made out of plastic bottles and glass bottles and tin soda cans and rubber tires. Tires, when stuffed with earth, they're extremely good insulators. You know, they keep the heat in the winter, the cool in the summer. And there are, you know, millions of these piles of tires apparently around the world. And this wild, white-haired guy is there instructing carpenters to be doing things in this development. And it turns out his name was Mike Reynolds. He was an architect until about 10 years ago. Well, first he was considered a lunatic, then just a heretic. And then about 10 years ago, he had his license revoked as an architect. And I asked him why. I mean, these houses were quite amazing. They were actually very beautiful. And he said, well, because you're not supposed to, like, run sewage underneath your living room. And that's exactly the way we run these houses. And they have these pipes that then fuel these jungles in the living room and dining room. And they are absolutely beautiful. He said, if anyone has to pay more than $100 for utilities for the year, we cover it. Soon, with everything that's happening today, the governor of New Mexico, then Richardson, gave them hundreds of acres and $500,000. And now these houses are being seen as a model for countries all over the world. He's hardly there near Los Alamos because there's so much demand. And he was building a 2-story one, he said, because Philadelphia has row houses and everyone's saying, oh, these are fine for rural areas, but what about in cities? And so he wants to prove you can build one with these tires at the back. And he took us on this fast tour. And I asked him, you know, why he's doing this and right near Los Alamos. And he said when they aired a film about him in Montreal, someone asked why he does this. And he stood up and he said, if all of the soldiers and all of the armies and all of the world would pick up hammers and build sustainable houses, we would not have to have the fossil fuel-driven wars that have determined this century. We could finally live at peace. And we broadcast that for the last half hour, one of the most popular segments we have ever done on Democracy Now! And then we made our way into Taos, where this group called Cultural Energy, who've been working to get radio stations, now got licenses for 2 full-power radio stations and a television station. There's a lot of hope in the world. But I want to go back to World War II for a minute, because the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, when he was handed the target list for the cities, the potential cities they could bomb, drop the plutonium and uranium bomb on that were developed at Los Alamos, he saw Hiroshima, he saw Nagasaki, and he saw Kyoto, and he crossed Kyoto off the list. He said he and Mrs. Stimson had visited Kyoto. It was a beautiful city, delicious food. The people were wonderful, the art magnificent. He didn't want to destroy this city. If only the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been lucky enough to host the Stimsons. But his point was so profound because he said, I know this city. And that I always see as an example of the power of independent media, what our awesome responsibility is. Because how do we learn about the rest of the world? Through our families, through friends who might come from other places, but mainly through the media. And it's absolutely essential that we see the rest of the world through something other than a corporate lens. And perhaps even more importantly, especially for national security, that the rest of the world see us through something other than a corporate lens brought to us by the weapons manufacturers when we're talking about war, or brought to us by the nuclear, the gas, the coal companies, the oil companies, when we're discussing climate change, or the insurance industries, or big pharma when we're discussing healthcare. We need something else. I have always believed that the media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. Instead, it is wielded as a weapon of war. Now, I'm looking forward afterwards to sign books for folks. Our latest book that Dennis and I wrote is called The Silenced Majority. And the reason we call it that is now, I really do think that people who are concerned about war, people who are concerned about the growing inequality in this country, people who are concerned about the raging forest fires in California and Colorado, the drenching rains in Florida, the dust bowl conditions of the Midwest, climate change, I mean, the fate of the earth. People who are concerned about these issues are not just a fringe minority, not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media, which is why we have to take it back.